Hashem, I have the great source to be able to at least join you from Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, at least virtually, So I want to begin by thanking, first of all, to thank Maishi and Jeremy for, of course, as always, making this possible and working so hard to ensure that I'm able to continue to give shir even if I'm not there, and that I'm able to have this chuston with all of you. Thank today's sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, Shmuley and Lieber Dinovitz, for dedicating all of the shiurim this month in memory of Shmuley's father, Harav Peretz Avram Ben Rabbi Yamin Moshe Zichron Livracha, and to thank Greg and Rachel Levitan for dedicating the shir information of the yahrzeit of Rachel's father, Mr. Burton Schwartz Ben Sion Ben Yisrael Shimon Zichron Levrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the families in Nechama. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Kesuvos, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, Kesuvos 13. We are picking up 4 lines down from the top at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says as follows. Oh, sorry. So the Mishnah says as follows. Sorry about that. Mishnah says, Hi omeres mukas eitz ani, v'hu omer lo ki ela drusas ish at. An interesting case. She claims, again, couple gets married, she's not a basula. So she claims, you're right, I'm not, in other words, I don't have basulim, but that's a result of mukas eitz, an injury. He claims, no, you're not mukas eitz, but rather you're not, there's no basulim because you are with another man. So what's the halacha? Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, omrim ne'emenes. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say that she is believed. So remember again, this is the same Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer that we already saw in the last Mishnah as well, that halacha l'maisa, we believe her, she has a cheskas kashrus, and ultimately, again, we take her word. Now, the truth is, we also assume that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Gamliel are motivated by the halachic concept of bari v'shema bari adif. That when you have 2 claims, one a definitive claim, one a possible claim, we always go with the definitive claim. So in this case, she's claiming bari, she's claiming again amukas eitz. He can't make a definitive claim. At most, he's claiming is a possibility. So therefore, bari v'shema bari adif. So the Gemara goes on. So the Gemara's Rabbi Yoshua says, no, lo mipi anu chayin. We literally, again, we do not live based on her word. Just because she says something doesn't automatically make it fact. Ela harezu becheskas drusas ish ad shetavi raya lidvareha. But rather, again, in fact, we will go ahead and assume that halacha l'maisa, the reason she's not a basula is because she must have had relations with another man, and therefore halacha l'maisa, and the burden of proof is upon her. So this is the same machlokus we had in the previous Mishnah. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer saying ultimately bari v'shema bari adif. She's making a bari claim, he's making a possible claim. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, we believe her. Versus Rabbi Yoshua says not necessarily. Again, the burden of proof is upon her. So says the Gemara, Ta'anasayu b'mai. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. Rashi says over here, Mahi tovaso umahu rotzalitin. What are they arguing about? In other words, practically, I understand the difference in claims, but lamaisa, what is it that she's claiming from him, and what is it that he's counterclaiming, or what is it that he's willing to do? So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Yochanan says she's claiming that she's entitled to a ksuva of 200 because as a mukas eitz, she is still a basula. And he's claiming I'm only obligated to go ahead and pay you 100. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Eliezer says, B'mana v'lo klum. Rabbi Eliezer says she's claiming a mana. Ultimately, again, and he's claiming that he owes her absolutely nothing. So watch this. So let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan or Masai Mumana. So Rabbi Yochanan holds that halacha l'maisa. In this case, she's claiming 200 zuz. He's only willing to pay her 100 zuz. So the Gemara says, Savalak Rabbi Meir da Amar bein hikirba bein lo hikirba masayim. So Rabbi Yochanan holds like the position of Rabbi Meir that we saw 2 days ago, namely that a mukas eitz, whether the husband was aware of the fact that she was a mukas eitz or not, ultimately, again, she gets a ksuva of masayim, which is another way of saying that a mukas eitz, a woman whose besulim are not there because of an injury, has the absolute status as a besula, and therefore halacha l'maisa gets a full-fledged ksuva. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, she's claiming I'm a basula without besulim, and he's claiming no, you had relations with another man, therefore you only get a ksuva of 100. Rabbi Lazar or Manav lo klum. Rabbi Lazar holds that no, the machlokes is she's claiming 100. He's saying, I owe you absolutely nothing. Savala krabanan da amri bein hikir ba bein lo hikir ba mana. Ultimately, again, he holds like the Rabbanon, and the Rabbanon hold that halacha l'maisa, whether he recognized, whether he knew she was a mukas eitz or didn't know that she was a mukas eitz, ultimately a mukas eitz is not treated like a basula, and therefore only gets 100. So she's claiming I'm a mukas eitz, I'm entitled to 100. He's claiming no, drusas ish, you had relations with another man, and therefore you're entitled to nothing. So let's analyze. So Bishlam Rabbi Lazar lo Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So I understand why Rabbi Lazar doesn't hold like Rabbi Yochanan. Why? To kamoki la kirabanan. Ultimately, again, because because Rabbi Lazar ultimately is establishing his position like the Rabbanon, that bein hikirba, bein lo hikirba, whether he knew she was a mukas eitz or didn't know she was a mukas eitz, she's only entitled to 100. El Rabbi Yochanan, my time aloma Rabbi Lazar. Why does Rabbi Yochanan not hold like Rabbi Lazar? The Gemara says, Kasavar kansa becheskas besula, v'nimtseis beula, yesh la ksuva mana. Because ultimately, again, he holds that in general, that if a man marries a woman thinking that she's a basula, and it turns out that she's not a basula, she's a beula, she still has a ksuva of a mana. So the Gemara says, Hacha huka amar mana, v'hika amra mana, ma ika bein taina dide letaina dida. So I'll say, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Rabbi Yochanan will say the problem in this case over here is that halacha l'maisa, he holds that number one, he holds like first of all, I'm sorry. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan, why doesn't hold like Rabbi Lazar? Because ultimately, let's do that once more. Because Rabbi Yochanan himself holds that if a man marries a woman with the expectation that she's a basula, but it turns out that she's a ba'ula, he holds it's not a mekachtos. He holds that she's still entitled ultimately to a ksuva of a mana. If that's the case, then ultimately, again, here they're both saying the same claim. Because Lamaisa, again, she's claiming a mana, he's claiming a mana. Maika bein taina didei, letaina dida. So Bishlam al Rabbi Lazar, Hainu diktani tarti. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. So remember again, now effectively in the last two Mishnayos, we pretty much have the same machlokes, right? In other words, it's two different cases, but the core machlokes is the same. The core machlokes ultimately is bari v'shema. In other words, you have on one hand, you have Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer holding, when you have bari v'shema bari adif, if she makes a definitive claim, he makes a possible claim, we believe her, because at the end of the day, bari v'shema bari adif, and Rabbi Yoshua is saying, no, the burden of proof is upon her to support her claim. So now the Gemara is asking, why do we need two Mishnayos teaching me the same machlokes? So says the Gemara as follows. So Bishlam Rabbi Elazar, Hainu diktani tarti. According to Elazar, I understand why I need both cases. Look at Rashi, Hainu diktani tarti. Bavi bimasnisin gabe plukta dimamona, hi omeres mishe erastani ne'enasti, vihi omeres mukase. So remember again, in the previous Mishnah, it was the same concept. Man marries a woman, turns out she's not a basula. So she claims mishe erastani ne'enasti. After Erusin, I was violated, and therefore nistap chosadehu, it's your mazel. It's your mazel. So there again, you have Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer saying she's believed, Rabbi Yoshua saying she's not believed. In our Mishnah, what's happened? So ultimately, man marries a woman thinking that she's a basula. Turns out that she's not a basula. She claims mukas eitz, he claims drusas ish. The same lines are drawn. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, we believe her. Bari v'shema, bari adif. Rabbi Yoshua, no, we do not believe her. So why do I need both? In other words, it's the same. Granted, it's two different cases, but conceptually, it's the same thing. So why do I need both cases? Why do I need both Mishnayos? So says the Gemara again. Bishlam Rabbi Lazar, Hainu diktani tarti, chada la'afuke midrami bar chama. One is to go ahead and exclude the position of Rami bar Chama, and ultimately v'chada la'afuke midrav Chia bar Abin. Amar Rav Sheshes. So I will say one is to exclude the position of Rami bar Chama, and one is to exclude the position of Rav Chia bar Abin. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says over chada la'afuke mid Rami bar Chama v'chada la'afuke hi omeres mishe erastani ne'enasti tana lemisni ba v'haya mekhi mekachtos legamrei mashma ve'in lo klum la'afuke mid Rav Chia bar Abin da amar le'el kinsa becheskas besula v'nimseis bula yesh la ksuvas mana. So interestingly enough, according to Elazar, I understand why I need the previous Mishnah. Why? That comes to exclude the position of Rami bar Chama. Because Rami bar Chama is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, If a man marries a woman, becheskas besula, and then it turns out that she's a ba'ula, ultimately, again, she gets a ksuva of a mana. So the previous Mishnah comes to exclude that particular position, and this Mishnah, chada la'afuki med Rav Chia bar Avin. This Mishnah comes to exclude the position of Rav Chia bar Amin. What does Rav Chia bar Amin say? So I'm sorry, v'chad la'afuke, that was Rami bar Chama, and then the other was to go ahead and exclude the position of Rav Chia bar Abin. Rav Chia bar Abin was the one who said that Allah Lamaisa, kinsa becheskas besula, v'ninseis bu'ula, she gets a ksuva of amana. El Rabbi Yochanan tarti lamali, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, why don't they both Mishnayos? To which the Gemara says, chada lahu di achal kochot Rabbi Gamliel. This is very interesting. One Mishnah is ultimately to teach me the position of Rabbi Gamliel, v'chada lahu di achal kochot Rabbi Yoshua, and one is to teach me the strength of the position of Rabbi Yoshua. Now, which one teaches me which? Watch this. Kamaisa lahu di achal kochot Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi say the previous Mishnah teaches me the strength of Rabbi Yoshua's position. Now remember again, Rabbi Yoshua is of the opinion, lo mi piha anu chayin. Literally, again, we do not live based on what she says. We don't trust her just because she says something doesn't automatically mean we take her word. So what does this mean? Ta'afagav di'ikala meimar migo lo mehemna. I will say, remember again, in the previous Mishnah, okay, let's just bring kind of everything together over here. In the previous Mishnah, Reuven marries Rachel thinking that she's a basula. It turns out that she's not a basula, or at least she doesn't have basulim. Okay, she claims mishe'irastani ne'enasti, after Erisinai was violated. So let's skip down to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua says she's not believed. No mi piyana chayin. So says the Gemara something very interesting. So Rabbi Yochanan will say the previous Mishnah, that Mishnah mishe'irastani ne'enasti, teaches me the strength of Rabbi Yeshua's position. Why? Because in that Mishnah she had a migo. What was the migo? She could have said mukas eitz. So even though she has a migo, Rabbi Yoshua still doesn't believe her. Basraisa, the Mishnah we just read, Lahodi Acha Kocha de Rabbi Gamliel. So this Mishnah that we just read, namely again the case of ultimately where he discovers that she's not a basula, she claims mukas eitz. He claims drusas ish. So this Mishnah comes to teaching the strength of Rabbi Gamliel's position. Why? Ta'afagav deleka migo. See, in this case, there is no migo. Why is there no migo in this case? Because she's claiming mukas eitz. If she's claiming mukas eitz, there's no longer any migo. Yet Rabbi Gamliel still believes her. The Gemara says, "Afagav deleka neimar migo mehemna." Good, beautiful. So therefore, I will say, even though both Mishnayos really seem to be, it's the same machlokas in both places, halacha lamaisa, both Mishnayos are novel in what it is that they teach. I'll point out, I think I mentioned this in yesterday's shir already, that Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch ultimately paskin like Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer in these cases, that halacha lamaisa, we're going to side with her claim because of the bari v'shema, bari adif in both of these cases. Good. Says the Mishnah. What's the next Mishnah? A very interesting case. Ra'uha midaberes im echad. They saw her speaking with someone. So again, in this case over here, there's Rachel, and they see Rachel speaking with someone. Now, we'll discuss exactly what speaking means. So what the Gemara says, Va'amru lo ma tivo shel ish zeh. So what's the nature of this guy? Who is this guy you were talking to? And she says, ma tivo shel ish zeh. Ish ploni v'koinu. So ultimately she claims that she tells us his name and that he's a Kohen. Okay. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Omrim ne'emenes. She is believed. Then I will say, now, what's the concern over here? The concern over here must be that there's a concern that she had relations with the guy. Right? So the shaila is like this. The shaila is, do we assume that the individual, the man who she was quote unquote talking to, is he a kosher? Is he someone who is genealogically fit and therefore relations with him does not impact her regarding future plans to marry into the kahuna? Or do we have to assume that he's pasul, right? That he's genealogically invalidated, and therefore halacha l'maisa, based on the quote-unquote speaking with him, she can now no longer marry into the kahuna. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Gamliel says, no. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer will say, now again, it's the third Mishnah, same idea. We believe her, but she's making a definitive claim. We don't have any proof to the contrary, and therefore halacha l'maisa, we will believe her. So Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Ne'aman, Rabbi Yeshua, Omer lo mipianu chayin, ela harezu becheskas be'ula, linisin ulamamzer, ad shetavi raya lidvareha. Incredible. So whereas Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say we believe her, Rabbi Yoshua will say, no, no mi piyanu chayim. We know we just because she says something we don't trust it, and therefore halacha lamaisa we have to assume the worst until we know the contrary. We have to assume the worst until we know the contrary. Ultimately, again, we have to assume that the man with whom she had relations, or whom she was quote unquote speaking, ultimately again is in a sin, is a mamzer. Therefore, again, she now becomes psula to marry into the kahuna. Incredible. Next case, haisim uberes. Let's say a single woman becomes pregnant. And we ask her, Va'amrullah, Matival shel uberzeh, tell us who's the father. Literally, we're asking her, what's the nature of the fetus? Which is another way of saying, who's the father? Who's the father? So she claims, Mi'ish ploni v'koinu. So she claims, this baby has yichus. The father is, so-and-so is the father. And ultimately, he's a Kohen. So again, the Gemara says, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Omrim ne'emenes. Now, obviously, we have to assume that this is a case where we cannot check out her claim with the supposed father. Because if you could check out the claim, just ask the guy. Just ask the guy. So, okay, assuming we can't do that, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer say she is believed. We believe her. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lami Pio Anu Chayin Ela Harei Becheskas Meuberes Lenesin Ulamamzer Ad Shetavi Raya Lidvareha. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yeshua says, no, we don't believe her. We don't, just because she says something doesn't automatically mean we believe her. And therefore, halacha lemaisa, we have to once again assume the worst, that the father of the baby is in a sin, is a mamzer, and therefore halacha lemaisa, the child is genealogically blemished. So we'll say, again, so now I just want to point out we have 4 cases, right? Two Mishnayos ago, which was the case of didn't find Besulim Misharastani and Nasni, the Mishnah that we started with today, right? Mukas Eitz versus Drusas Ish, and now again, these last 2 cases, Ra'uha Midaberes, she was talking with someone, and then Ra'uha Mi'uberes. Good. And it's all the same machlokes between, on one hand, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer versus Rabbi Yoshua. Says the Gemara, my Midaberes. Okay, so let's talk. Tachlis. What does it mean that we saw her talking with a guy? So Ziri Amar Nistera. Ziri says we saw her secluded with someone, and obviously secluded with someone means secluded for long enough for something illicit to have occurred. Ravasi Amar Nivala. Ravasi says no, literally there's eidos that she had bia. There's eidos that she had relations with this guy. So it says the Gemara Bishlam al Ziri Hainu Diktani Midaberes. So according to Ziri, I understand what midaberes means, right? So midaberes ultimately means in other words, that she was alone. She was talking. In other words, the word midaberes means we could also understand to mean nistera, that she was alone. El Ravasi, my midaberes. According to Ravasi, if there's actual eidos that she had bia with this guy, why are we calling it midaberes? Lishna ma'alya. The Mishnah is choosing to use a nicer lashon. It's euphemistic. So midaberes actually means that we saw that she engaged in relations with the guy, but lamaisa we're using a nicer lashon. Kedichsiv achla umach va'amra lo pa'alti oven. So we'll say the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishlei, when it calls Klal Yisrael compares the sinner to a woman who commits adultery. The pasuk says that ultimately she eats, right? She eats kach derech isha mina efes. This is the way of the adulterous woman. Achla, she eats umach sapia. She wipes her mouth. So wiping her mouth, of course, is a euphemism for cleaning up after bia. So ultimately, again, so you see this idea of ultimately sometimes using a euphemistic phrase. Of course, the euphemism doesn't work so well once you have to go ahead and explain it. But I guess at least the Mishnah, the euphemistic benefit kind of goes out the window. All right, but Lamaisa, again, the Mishnah tried to use a nicer lashon in order to keep things a little bit simpler, a little bit cleaner. Okay, so Bishlam al-Ziri Hainu Diktani Tarti Midaberes Uberes. According to Ziri, I understand why I have 2 cases in Mishnah. One where we saw her quote unquote talking, and one where we see her pregnant. Because the case of talking, according to Ziri, is just we saw her alone with the guy. Something may or may not have occurred. The case of Uberes, where she's pregnant, we know something occurred. So the Gemara says, El Ravasi Tarti Lam, according to Ravasi, who holds that midaberes actually means that we saw her have bia, then why do I need 2 cases of both midaberes and mi'uberes? It's the same thing. Both are cases where we know she had bia with someone. Oh, so we'll say one is to teach me ultimately again the fact that in case number one, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, so that case is about her personal kashrus. The second case is about the kashrus of her offspring. So Hani Chalamandar will say first, second wide line, you'd give him and Aleph. Hani Chalamandar Bebita. So that makes sense according to the opinion who says that all of the opinions who say that she will be kosher ultimately agree that her offspring will be kosher as well. Now, both say, take a look at Rashi, by the way. When we speak about the kashrus of her offspring, so Rashi says over Bebita, last short line in Rashi, if her offspring is a girl, tinase lekahuna. Ultimately, the offspring is able to marry into the kahuna. Rabbi Gamliel, diashurina bidida havamina ihi hoyov the havale chazaka the kashrus meikara amri ukma chazaka velo tafsilena aval ubar delo havale chazaka the kashrus emelo. This is very interesting. So now what we're saying is like this. Even according to Rabbi Gamliel, maybe when Rabbi Gamliel says that we believe her, that's because a woman has a chazkas kashrus. So if she has a cheskes kashrus, and we have no, right, we have no definitive information to the contrary, her cheskes kashrus remains, and halacha lemaisa, she is kosher. But maybe with her offspring, the fetus doesn't have a cheskes kashrus, so maybe we would say in this case of the Mishnah, where we don't know who the father is, perhaps we do have to assume the worst, and the offspring doesn't have cheskes kashrus. Kamash malon, that's not the case. Kamash malon, that's not true. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us both cases. So that works well, says the Gemara, according to the one who says that the same way we say the mother's kshera, the baby will also be a kshera. But according to the opinion who says that no, it's only the woman herself has a cheskes kashrus, but we don't apply the cheskes kashrus to the uber. What is there to say? Here we go. Ravasi savar kiman darmal divrei machsher ba machsher bebita. Ravasi himself holds that the one who says that the mother is kosher will also say that the fetus retains a cheskes kashrus as well. Amar li Rav Papa leZeiri. So Rav Papa said to Zeiri the following: My midaberes nistera. So we'll say, let's analyze a bit more. What does midaberes mean? Midaberes, when it says that again, the first case of the Mishnah, we start talking with someone nistera. That means they were alone for long enough for something to have occurred. And Rabbi Yeshua holds that halacha lemaisa is incredible. Rabbi Yeshua holds that halacha lemaisa, essentially, we see Rachel alone with someone, right? We ask her, who is it? She gives us a name. And she says, he's a Kohen, he's a kosher. Rabbi Yeshua says, we don't believe her. We don't believe her. We have to assume that it was a nisin, that it was a mamzer. And therefore what that means is that now Rachel, who was just secluded with someone who we don't know. So number one, so we don't know who it was, and we don't even know actually for sure what happened in seclusion. Halacha l'maisa Rabbi Yeshua will say that she is psula to marry into the kahuna. So the Gemara says, is that true? Hamarav malkin ala yichud vein osrin ala yichud. Rav says, listen to this. We give malchus for yichud, right? In other words, that remember yichud is that a man and woman who are not married or directly related to one another are not permitted to be alone with each other. That's a rabbinic prohibition. Actually, true, this is a machlokas. We'll go with the idea it's a rabbinic prohibition. So the halacha is that if a man and woman are violation of yichud, they get malchus. Rashi says malchus mardus, rabbinically, midarabanan. However, ve'ein osrin, but we do not declare a woman unfit to marry into the kahuna based on the fact that she violated the Isser Yichud. Look at Rashi. Ve'ein osrin, isha al baila b'shel yichud ba'ama. So here it's saying, let's say a married woman was alone with another man who was not her husband. We would not answer her to her husband based on yichud. Or I should say, we would not answer her to her husband if she violated the halachos of yichud. So what do you see from here? You see from here that yichud is aser. You might even get rabbinic malchus over yichud. But lamaisa yichud doesn't impact status. If that's the case, then how could Rabbi Yeshua go ahead and say, right? If we go according to Zeiri, that midaberes and the Mishnah doesn't mean bia, it just means stira, it just means they were alone with each other, then how could Rabbi Yeshua say that she would be prohibited to marry into the kahuna based on this yichud? To which the Gemara says, Lema delok Rabbi Yeshua, right? It must be not like Rabbi Yeshua. To which the Gemara says, it has to be that this doesn't reflect the position of Rabbi Yoshua. In other words, that ultimately, again, so apparently, again, the statement is not in conformance with Rabbi Yoshua. Okay? Afilutim Rabbi Yoshua. No, it could even be Rabbi Yoshua. How so? Maila asu biyuchsin. It could be that in general, Rabbi Yoshua would agree that yichud doesn't impact status. There's only one situation where yichud impacts status, and that's by the kahuna. Because when it comes to maintaining the genealogical fitness of the kahuna, we're more machmir. The truth is, we've actually seen many different examples of this. So therefore, maybe dafka by kahuna, that's what Rabbi Yoshua is going to be machmir. So meisvei areza kasha ru'ua shenichna im echad l'seiser. If we saw ultimately a woman enter in with a man, right? Enter into a man to say into a private place. So she's secluded with a man. Let's say you'd give him days, or into a ruin. Va'amrullah, we ask her. Now we'll say again. So here's the issue. The issue is she's going into a yichud, she's alone. Churva ruins were historically places where people would arrange illicit unions. So va'amrullah, we ask her, Ma tivo shel ish zeh, you went into the ruin, or you went into seclusion with this man. What's the nature? Who is this guy? Right? Ma tivo shel ish zeh, and she answers us, zeh kohenhu, uben achi abahu, and she gives us the guy is a kohen, or he is uben achi, he is the son of my father's brother, my cousin. So what's the halacha? So in other words, the point is she's saying the person who I was alone with is someone ultimately who is genealogically fit. So Rabbi Elazar Omer ne'emenes. Rabbi Elazar say that she's ne'emenes, she's believed. Rabbi Yoshua Omer lo mi pia anu chayin ela hari zu b'cheskas b'ulinasin ulamamzer ad shetavi raya lidvareha. And again, I'll say, here you have it. Rabbi Yoshua is saying that halacha l'maisa. No. If she went into yichud, we have to assume the worst. That she had bia, that the guy who she was alone with, and Rabbi Yoshua not only was there alone, but we have to assume bia occurred, that the guy is a nasin or a mamzer, until she brings proof that she had yichud, that she was alone with someone who was kosher. To which the Gemara says, Bishlam al-zi'iri, hainu diktani tarti, l'seiser or l'churva. So according to Zeiri, I understand ultimately again why you need both of these cases. Both seiser, which ultimately means yichud in general, right? Or churva, which means a ruin. Now again, remember, Rashi points out over here, the churva is stama lebe'ila shumakum znus. El Ravasi, the Amar Nivala, but according to Ravasi, ultimately again, who says that Medaberes means Nivala, Tarti Lamali, why don't you both the case of Churva and Stira, Chada Katani, L'Seiser de Churva. Now, according to Ravasi, the way you would read this case is not as either or, Stira or Churva, but rather it's actually one phrase, L'Stira de Churva. She entered into the isolation, or isolation is the wrong word, not isolation, to the privacy, right? To the privacy of the churva. In other words, it's one act. But that's not what it says, right? In other words, the Brisa seems to indicate that it's two different things, l'seiser or l'chorva. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Chada l'chorva de masa, v'chada l'chorva de dabra. It's two different types of chorvas. One was a ruin in the city, and one was a ruin in the desert. Okay, so the Gemara says, what's the difference between these two? I'll say, first of all, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says there's something very interesting. Chorva de masa, what does it mean, a ruin in the city? Stam bi'ilasa me'echad b'mnei ha'ir. It's very interesting. V'ika l'meimar bi'ir shrubi yisrael shem kamar. When it is a ruin in the city, listen to this, when a woman is alone with a man in a ruin in a city, we assume that the man who she was alone with was a man from that city. Now, in a case where, let's say, the majority of the city are Jews, are ksherim, then you could assume based on Rov that even if she had bia, it was with a kosher. Masha Enkin, Rashi says, the Dabra, Rashi says, Safek echad misofa olam balakan, ve'rov ha'olam ovdei kochavim uposlim isha bebiasam lekuhuna. So supposed to listen to this. But if it was a ruin in the desert, Dabra literally means desert. What it means is an isolated place outside of the city. Anyone has access to that. You have to go after not the rov of the city, but the rov of the world. The rov of the world are ovdei kochavim, are psulim. over the world are psulim, and therefore halacha l'maisa you'd have to assume that if she had bia with a pasul, and ultimately now she'd be invalid. Utzrichi, the Gemara says, here we go. That's the difference between a chorva de masa and a chorva de dabra. Chorva de masa, if the city is ruin in a city, if the city happens to be Yisraelim, then you could assume the man with whom she had relations was Yisrael, rov ksherim, right? If it was a chorva de dabra, a ruin in the desert, then you'd have to assume that the man with whom she had relations was a pasul. So it says the Gemara Tzrichi. You need both cases. Why? If it would have just told me about a ruin in a city, I would say in that case, Rabbi Gamliel says that she's kosher. Why? Because if we assume that it was a city of Jews, the rov are Jews, that's why we could assume that even if she had bia in this seclusion, it was with a kosher. However, but ultimately, again, if it was a ruin in the desert, the rov psulin etzla, where we have to assume the majority of the people are psulim. Ultimately, again, Ema Mode Leil Rabbi Yoshua. Perhaps even Rabbi Gamliel would agree with Rabbi Yoshua that we would have to assume that she is a psula. V'yashmo'inon bahi come Rabbi Yoshua. And if we would have just at the previous case, in that case, Rabbi Yoshua says his position. Aval baha Ema Mode Rabbi Gamliel. But in the previous case, perhaps, or in this case, perhaps he would agree with Rabbi Gamliel. Therefore, tzricha. Therefore, I will say ultimately, again, both cases are necessary. So really, really quite fascinating. So I will say, so therefore, what we have up until now is as follows. What we have over here is first case in the Mishnah. Ra'uha midaberes. We saw her speaking with someone. We ask her, who are you talking with? She tells us, it was Aaron HaKohen, great guy, wonderful guy. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer say, okay, we believe her. Rabbi Yoshua once again says, lo mi pia anu chayin. Machlokes in the Gemara, what does midaberes mean? Rav Zeiri says midaberes just means nistara. They were secluded. Rav Asi says, nivala. No, we know that relations occurred. We know that relations occurred. So then good Rabbi says, so we go ahead and we compare this to the rest. I'll just point out, by the way, we also see an interesting halacha regarding yichud over here, which Rabbi says is very important. Halacha l'maisa, we passing with yichud. Yichud is an issa d'Rabbanan, and therefore if you violated it, you get malchus mardus. But yichud does not impact status. Does not impact status. So a woman, let's say, would not become asur to her husband because of yichud. And even according, so now just follow this 1 second. And even according to Zeiri, who says that the case of midaberes is yichud, Ayin Rabbi Yoshua is answering a woman based on yichud. That's only because of the kahuna. That's only because ma'ala asabi yuchsin. Okay, so let's go weiter. Meisvei, let's raise the kasha. Zu edus sha'isha ksherala. This type of edus is an edus that a woman is believed for. Both say what type of edus? Look at Rashi. Zu edus atzma ksher lomer lakasher nevalti. The case in our Mishnah. Well, let's say again. A man said, right? A woman says, or this. Let's go with this case. A woman was alone with a man. We ask her who was the man, who was the right, or we saw her quote unquote speaking with a man. We ask her who was the guy, and she gives us the name. It's Aaron HaKohen. Aaron HaKohen, right? So ultimately, again, the Brisa says over here, this is an eidos that a woman is believed, which seems to support the position of Rabbi Gamliel, right? Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, and ultimately again refutes the position of Rabbi Yoshua, to which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yoshua Omer Eino Ne'emenes. Rabbi Yoshua says, no, she's not believed. She's not believed. Now, when we say she's not believed, Rashi says, Linasela Kohen, that we have to assume that the man with whom she had relations with was apostle, and therefore, again, she is genealogically impacted, and therefore prohibited to go ahead and, or status impacted, I should say, and therefore not permitted to go ahead and marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, Amar lahem Rabbi Yoshua. So watch this. Rabbi Yoshua says to Rabbi, well, in this case, it sounds like the Rabbanon, but it's Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer. Watch this. Would you not agree with me in the following case? Let's say a woman is taken captive, and there are witnesses that she was taken captive. Vihi omeres tahora ani, and she says, I was not violated by my captors. She'ena ne'emenes, that we don't believe her. Even though she says, I wasn't violated by my captors, we don't believe her. We don't believe her. Amru lo aval. They said, yes, we agree with you in that case. They agree with you in that case. Uma hefresh yesh bein zu lezu. To which Rabbi Yeshua says, so let me get this straight. So you agree with me in a case where a woman is taken captive. And there are witnesses to the fact that she was taken captive. And she says, but I wasn't violated. In that case, we do not believe her. Right? Rabbi Yeshua says, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar. They say, yes, we agree with you in that case of the Shvuya. So what's the difference between that case and this case? This case being, we saw her speaking with someone and we assume that Bia occurred. We ask her, who was the man? She gives us a name. We shouldn't believe her. We shouldn't believe her. So why don't you believe her? Right? You won't believe her in the case of the Shvuya, but you will believe her in the case of the Mishnah of Midaberes. Or Mahafresh Yesh Bein Zu Lezu, to which there's a very simple distinction. Lezu Yesh Edim or Lezu Ein Edim. 1 second. There's a big difference. In the case of the Shavuya, in the case of the woman taken captive, there are witnesses that she was taken captive, right? And remember, part of what happens in captivity is that the woman is violated. We know that occurs, or at least we know with enough frequency that occurs, that Allah Lamaisa, we assume that's what occurred. So once you have eidos that she's taken captive, it's almost as if that there's eidos that she was violated. In this case over here, there's no eidos. We know that she was alone with a guy, right? But we don't know anything more than that. Amar lahem af lazu yesh edim shari kreise ben shineha. So listen to this. Rabbi Yoshua's, but 1 second. In this case over here, first of all, look at Rashi. Luzu ein edim shenevala shelo ra'ua ela medaberes. Remember again, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say back to Rabbi Gamliel say back to Rabbi Yoshua. In this case, in the Mishnah, we don't know that she had relations at all, right? All we saw was medaberes. Umigudi by amr lalonev alti, right? Ki amra the front. Af Rashi says, kilomar af kan yesh acha sheyesh la'idim va'atem cholkim b'elisa. So listen to this. So Rabbi Yoshua says, but in the case of the Mishnah, there's also eidos. What's the eidos? She's pregnant. Now he's referring now to the second case of the Mishnah, right? In the second case of the Mishnah, she's pregnant. So in the case, so you want to say in the first case of midaberes, there's no eidos that there was bia. In the case of when she's pregnant, it's pretty clear that there's bia. To which the Gemara Shari Kreisa Ben, literally again, her stomach is between her teeth. That's the hyperbolic expression ultimately of pregnancy. Armulo rov ovdei kochavim prutzim ba'arayosem. So they said back to Rabbi Yoshua, the majority of ovdei kochavim are prutzim ba'arayos. Now again, I will say we're going to go through this exchange. At first glance, when you read through it, the exchange doesn't make sense. So we'll read it and then we'll explain it. So they say back to Rabbi Yoshua, right? Rov ovdei kochavim prutzim ba'arayos. The majority of idolaters are immoral. Okay, so Amr Lahen, Rabbi Yeshua says back to them, Ein apetropos la'arayos. Ultimately, again, there's no guardian against immoral behavior. Okay, when is that true? Ultimately, again, when a woman is giving testimony about her own status. Aval eidos isha babita divrei hakol avlad shtuki. But ultimately, again, when it comes to a woman testifying about the kashrus of her offspring, everyone agrees the child is a shtuki. Okay, that's the exchange. Maika amar lahu umaika mahadrele. So the Gemara says, what is Rabbi Yeshua saying to the Rabbanon, to Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, and what ultimately are they responding to him? So in other words, both say the exchange was pretty clear until this last part. Here we go. Hachi ka'amar lo, hachi ka'amra le, ka'amri le. This is what Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua respond back to. This is what Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer respond back to Rabbi Yeshua. Ala me'uberes matishivenu. So the Gemara, so listen to this. So this is what they say. Ultimately, again, fine. I understand what you're saying about the woman who's pregnant, that you want to say that there's eidos there, that there was bia. But what will you say about the first case in the Mishnah, where ultimately, again, she's quote-unquote talking. In other words, we have no eidos that there was any kind of bia. Amar lahen, to which Rabbi Yoshua will respond, Midaberes hainu shvuya. Rabbi Yeshua says in my book, Midaberes is the same thing as shvuya. Just like by shvuya, we know that she was violated. So to Rabbi Yeshua says, by Midaberes, we know that there was bia. So which the Gemara says, Amru lo. They say back to Rabbi Yeshua, it's not true. Shiny shvuya. Shvuya is different. Why? The rov ovdei kochavim prutzim ba'arayosem. Because the majority of idolaters are immoral. So therefore, when a woman is taken captive by idolaters, we know with almost absolute certainty that she was violated. That she was violated. So Amar Lahem, Rabbi Yoshua said, but again, according to Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, that's fundamentally different than the case of Midaberes. In the case of Midaberes, we don't know that anything happened. Amar Lahem, Rabbi Yoshua responds, Hanami kevan de estatir ein apetropis la'arayas. Rabbi said, this is incredible. Rabbi Yoshua says, the truth is, once a man is alone with a woman, we have to assume that something happened. Why? Ein apetropis la'arayas. There is no guardian against illicit behavior. I will say, which is such an